Hello everyone, Jolene here from Bookworm Adventure Girl. Welcome back. I hope that you are all well. This is where I talk about the books that I'm reading. I like to read diverse books and I highlight Canadian literature. If you are new here, thanks so much for checking out my channel. Please hit subscribe and stick around. Today I am going to be wrapping up the books that I finished in January. And I am also going to introduce the TBR Stack. It's a little scary. This is a new way that I am going to try and keep track of the unread books on my shelf, so you can follow along and see how well I either succeed or fail by the end of the year. Well, let's actually start there. If you've been around for a while, then you might remember that I used to revisit my book hauls, and I will leave a link to that playlist below so that you can see what it is that I'm talking about. Sometimes I would have read some of the books that I've hauled, sometimes half, or sometimes even just over half. It was never really more than that, at least that I remember. It was a good way, sort of, to be accountable if I was reading the books that I was bringing into the house. But it wasn't always accurate on how many books I still had on my shelves to read. So this year, and like every other year really, I want to read more books from my shelves. I know every booktuber says this, but I really do want to focus on reading the books that I own. I'm not doing a buying ban or anything like that, but my goal is to have less unread books on my shelves at the end of the year than I do right now. So here's the confession. I have a lot of books, a lot. More than half of them are read, but I have a lot of unread books. So many, in fact, that it's hard to keep track and actually count them all. So I have done a count, sort of, and I know approximately how many books I still have unread. And probably once I get the number down to a decent number, I will be able to be more accurate about it. Now I know there are people who have big TBRs and they talk about having a couple hundred books to read, but my TBR is huge. I have approximately, wait for it, 1,500 unread books on my shelves. So I will let that sink in for a minute. It means I have more than that on my shelf that are read, but it's still a very large number. So this year I am going to keep track of how many books I've read and how many books I am putting on my shelves that go unread. By the end of the year, if I have less than 1,500 books unread, then I will have been successful. We will see how it goes. So I hope you have fun following along with that. And please send me some positive vibes that this goes well. Okay, moving on to what I read in January. In January, I was just getting back into the reading swing of things. So I only finished 5 books, but I think 5 is a fine number. One of them was a reread. I don't often reread, but I will tell you more about that when I get to it. And I will also tell you why I chose to change the original rating of the book. Okay, so let's take a look at some stats. As I said, I read 5 books, which was a total of 1,479 pages. The top moods were emotional, reflective, dark, funny, tense, sad, and hopeful. That seems about right to me, and it will be interesting to see if and how these change throughout the year. 60% of the books that I read were less than 300 pages, and 40% were between 300 and 499 pages. I read all fiction in January. You will see this change in February. The genres that Storygraph has put the books in are contemporary, dystopian, LGBTQIA++, magical realism, thriller, romance, and literary. And the star ratings are even across the board from 3 stars to 5 stars. So this is the first wrap up of 2024. And I think for this one, I am going to share the books in the order that I enjoyed them. So from least enjoyed to most enjoyed. But there were no books in January that I didn't like at all or anything like that. And I'm going to start with my 3-star reads. I have 2 books that I would put in the 3 or 3.5 star category. So first up is Luster by Raven Leilani. This book took me a while to get to. It's a book that I had heard a lot of good things about. It's a debut novel, and I think for a debut, this is really good. It's a good start. I would definitely read more by this author. For me, Luster started out quite strong. You have a young Black woman, Edie, who is having an affair with a married, older white man named Eric. The way this relationship is written, at least at the beginning, is intense. Eric has rules for the relationship, because of the fact that he's married. And Edie does her best to go along with it. I did not like Eric at all. I don't think I was supposed to. But he gave me a very icky kind of feeling. Not surprisingly, Edie is curious about Eric's wife. They end up meeting, and when Edie loses her job, she ends up moving in with the couple. And this is where the book went a little off the rails for me. It turns out that Eric and his wife have adopted a little girl who is Black. So it seems that this will work out for the couple, because by having Edie move in with them, this will also mean that their daughter will have a Black female role model. So this book is very character driven, and the intensity of the relationships is palpable at times, but it lost its oomph for me shortly after Edie moves in with the family. And I get that the story is about these relationships being complex and how Edie handles herself, but it kind of was going one way for me, and then it took a different direction entirely, especially just in the feel of the story. So I'm glad I read this, and I do think that the writing was good in a lot of ways. If you watched my last video, then you know that I turned one of my friend AJ's videos into a tag. And one of the prompts was Friend Zone, books that you thought you were going to love, but they were just okay. And AJ had this as one of their examples. And if they hadn't, I would have used it in the tag. I will leave both of those videos linked in the description box below, so that you can see what other books kind of stayed in the friend zone for both AJ and myself. So this brings the TBR stack to 1,499. The next book that I finished in January was gifted to me by Lindy from Lindy's Magpie Reads, and this is another debut, and I love the cover of this book. There might even be some resemblance to the author. The book is really good, actually, by Monica Heisey. There were a number of things I really liked about this book, and there were some things that I didn't. Maggie, the main character, is not quite 30, and her marriage to John is ending. At first, she still has hopes, I think, of fixing the relationship. In some ways, she's still immature, I thought. Yet her spiraling thoughts and her inner voice, I thought was written well, especially in how, her thoughts and some of her actions were not always rational. There are some funny lines in the book, but I felt like the book dragged on, and eventually it felt like the book was trying too hard to be funny. I also thought that the main character didn't really show any growth or character development, and it was frustrating, and there were plenty of chances, I thought, for that to happen. So I eventually just found her boring too. It was one of those books that I think had a lot of potential, and I thought I would really, really like it. But in the end, it was just okay for me, and this is another book that would probably be in the friend zone for me. Would I read more by this author? I would probably try some other things by this author. This was a debut, so I'd like to see if another book by this author would have more substance. The author is a screenwriter, I think mostly known for the show Schitt's Creek. So it will be interesting to see, what she comes up with next. So this brings the TBR stack to 1,498. Okay, now I have 2 books that I would rate 4 to 4.5 stars. And the first is a rom-com from one of my newer favorite authors. It's Part of Your World by Abby Jiminez. This is the first of a series, or at least a duology at this point. This is totally a girl from big city meets boy from small town trope. Their lives are so different. In this one, Alexis is rich and is a professional. Daniel lives a normal life in a town where everyone knows everyone, and he is quite happy with a more simple life. And when the two meet, they have an instant connection. Even Daniel's dog Hunter likes Alexis. But for Alexis, she figures this is just a fling because there's no way that Daniel can fit into her life. What I love about Abby Jiminez is the banter, the one-liners, the laugh out loud moments. And this had a few, but not like her others. I thought this was good, but also felt very predictable. And it was a little too Hallmarky for me, if that's a word, at least to give it a 5 stars. So I have liked her other books better, but I still think this was worth a read, and I do hope to read the next book in the series. I am interested if it will be similar to her Friend Zone series, where like each of the books can be read as standalones, but they are connected, or if this will continue Alexis and Daniel's relationship. If it does that, I think it can redeem this story a little for me, but we will see how that all goes. So this is good, I think, for anyone who likes lighthearted rom-com romances, and if you are already a fan of Abby Jiminez. So this brings the TBR stack to 1497. Okay, the next book I read was for the Reading Across Canada Challenge. I will leave a link to the Reading Across Canada Challenge 2024 introductory video so that you can check it out if you're interested. The prompt in January was to read a debut novel, and it turns out that this is the 3rd debut novel on this list that I read in January. But it's the first Canadian one, and I read Cereus Blooms at Night by Shani Mootoo. This book, it has a lot of layers to it. The narrator of the story I thought was an interesting choice. The narrator is Tyler, who is a nurse at a nursing home where Mala Ramchandran is being brought to because she is thought to be a murderer, and she has been found to be unfit to stand trial. So Tyler is telling this story in the hopes of finding Mala's sister. The setup is quite intriguing. It might be slow at first, but I think it's worth it. So Mala doesn't really speak. She seems kind of out of it. But Tyler, for some reason, is able to connect with her in ways that other people can't, and he becomes her nurse. So in order to understand Mala, we learn about her father. And Shani Mootoo makes you feel for characters in this book. You either really like them or you really don't. And with Mala's father, at the beginning, I really liked him until I really didn't. She totally plays with your emotions. So he seems likable and then becomes an abuser. We also learn about a special relationship that Mala had with a young boy that she calls Boy E. And this relationship is quite important, and it becomes intertwined with the story of Mala's father. And it is Boy and his son who connect the past to the present, and we learn why Mala is suspected of murder, why the estranged relationship between Mala and Boy, and why Mala hasn't heard from her sister. So this story has so much in it. There are some difficult scenes, very real scenes. It's a story about love. There's queer love, unrequited love, what can happen when love isn't returned. The story is actually quite tragic, but somehow it's also redemptive. And I also loved how the author brought nature into the story. So the connections that are made to the Cereus flowers, I thought was very clever. And I will definitely read more by this author. This is the second book that I've read by Shani Mootoo. And I think in a lot of ways she's a Canadian author that flies under the radar. So this brings the TBR Stack to 1496. So my final book is a book that I reread, and it's Moon of the Crusted Snow by Waubgeshig. I reread this in preparation for a buddy read that I will be doing with Danni from Danni Dabbles, as we are going to be reading the sequel to this when it is published in the US for Danni. So when I first read Moon of the Crusted Snow, it was January of 2020. I really enjoyed it, and I gave it 4 stars. After the reread, I changed my rating. So this is a dystopian story about a reservation community in the north, and when cell service goes down, they are so isolated, they don't know what's going on, and they don't really think much of it until they realize that something more serious must be happening. The community comes together to decide what they're going to do, how they're going to ration food, and how they're going to help each other. And then an outsider shows up, and the community has to decide if they can trust him or not. So when I finished the book this time, I felt it in a completely different way. It still has the elements of a northern community, indigenous ways of knowing and thinking, with a nod to the wisdom of elders. And there is a subtle and eerie, suspenseful feel to it. The difference this time is we have now lived through a pandemic. So reading it again with that perspective made me realize how much more this book had to offer. And I changed my rating to a 5-star read. And I can't wait to read the next book with Danni to see where Waub takes us in this story. So because this was a reread and a book that is already on my shelf, that I've read before, it doesn't count, unfortunately, towards my TBR stack. So the TBR stack remains at 1496. So we will have to see when I do my February book haul if the TBR stack surpassed 1500 or if it stays below 1500. Spoiler alert, it will totally explode past it. But depending on how my wrap up goes in February, we will see if I make it below 1500 again. So stay tuned for that. So please let me know if you have read any of these books, if you are interested in reading any of them. What did you read in January that you enjoyed the most or that you would recommend? I would love to hear all about it. I look forward to chatting with you in the comments. As always, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and don't forget to make every day an adventure.